Well, we have a very unique narrative. Our house was at Finkel and Dexter, and we lived there until 1969. And Finkel and Dexter at our intersection was where part of the riots took place. But in our neighborhood, we were one of the only white people on the block. We were the minority on our block. So that was our life as we knew it. I was a city girl. We were all city kids. We took buses everywhere and ran around the neighborhood, and we were city kids. And we were not happy to leave Detroit when we moved from after the riot.
Yeah, what was it like to experience the riots?
You know, I think about the riots a lot because we're from this great, big, huge Irish Catholic family that had lots of chaos and stuff going on in the house. And I remember seeing the riots outside the window, and I felt like maybe it was like the Boston Tea Party. And like all this stuff was going on, and we were witnessing history. I didn't feel particularly vulnerable. I guess that's what I'm saying about this, because the our lives didn't feel terribly different from the what we were seeing on the street. Does that make sense? But we could see it all. They were burning down the buildings, and my friend Miss Ann at the corner, an African American woman that had a cleaners, she just stood in front of her store. She was my little girl buddy when I was a kid. I'd go see her when I wanted to make money and stuff. And she stood in front of her store with her rifle, and she was going to protect her store. But after a couple of days, our family left, and my dad had bought a house on Grosseal, which was very intriguing because we have a house in inner city Detroit, and then my dad bought a house on an island. But it wasn't like the rich people part of the island. It was the most fall down house you've ever seen in this very affluent neighborhood. And his house looked like, you know, like it should have been demolished. But we went out to Grosseal during the riot, and then we came back for one more year. So I think what I remember being more traumatic within the context of history is that the riots happened, and then a year immediately after the riots happened was when Martin Luther King got killed. And I was on a bus going through Detroit, and just that feeling of maybe the things that we put hope into were gone. So, yeah. So we moved from Detroit to Grosseal. It was very, very strange. My brother brought some of his friends from high school out who happened to be African American, and the police showed up at our door because there had never been any black people on Grosseal before. So it was intriguing. And it was hard for us because we lost our autonomy. We couldn't we were stuck on an island. We couldn't leave without our mom driving us somewhere. We couldn't go downtown. It's like, will you drive us? So it was like a prison in its own way. Plus, we didn't fit. We were city kids, you know. But also, back to that question, there's an 18-year age span between myself and all my siblings from top to bottom, and everybody's experience is quite different about the riot.
Yeah.
So I didn't like Grosseal, and I went to a parochial high school downriver. I wasn't necessarily what they thought was college material, but I went to Henry Ford for a year, the community college, the local community college, and got paid my way through school by cleaning the houses of the affluent on Grosseal. And then I moved back to Detroit, and I moved to my grandmother's, and her house is at Woodward and the Boulevard. And then I went to Wayne State. So I went to Wayne State for 3 years. And I'd walk down Woodward Avenue to go to school, and I worked at the campus restaurant, and then I would take buses home to Grosseal on the weekend to clean people's houses. And that was kind of my life in the city. Wayne State was very diverse, very working class, had a lot of association with students that were very political about equity and equality. So somewhere in here is the question, well, how'd you end up at U of M? Yeah. So anyways, how did I end up at U of M? for me, I was the first in my family to ever go to college or graduate college. We were blue collar kids with blue collar values, and it was more because I didn't know what else I could do in life. I got kind of cranky, and people said I wasn't college material, and I said I'm going, or maybe I had done enough cleaning of houses and childcare that I was like, I got to do something. But I remember going to U of M because some friends and I from high school, we took a field trip up to Ann Arbor. I mean, literally that's what it felt like. This place called Ann Arbor. We had never been. Here it is 50 miles away from where I live, and I'd never seen it. So we go up to Ann Arbor, it was so beautiful, and people were walking around, and there was all these, like, different culture, like a whole different culture than any place I'd ever seen before, like diversity, and it was so pretty. And I think I was going to Wayne when we took that field trip, and it was in my brain, as this like a movie scene college, right? And then it just kind of stayed in my brain. I never knew what I wanted to do in life. I knew what I didn't want to do. That was kind of interesting to me, I mean, I knew I wanted a master's, and I knew I cared a lot about education, and I taught special ed, and I have a sort of I don't know, I was fighting against the system as I began as a teacher, and I wanted to understand more what the system was like, if that makes any sense. I felt like more change needed to go take place in education, and I intended to work in an administrative capacity, but I never did. I got out of U of M, and I took a little world tour, and I came back, and I was kind of an in the trenches teacher. So just back to the Detroit narrative just briefly, I think what's intriguing to me is that when I was 19 was when I moved back to Detroit, and now my family is no longer in Detroit. They're on this island. And they went on and on and on about how I couldn't live in Detroit and how dangerous Detroit is. And I went out one weekend back to Groseal where they lived, and I took my sister's babysitting job, and I got robbed at gunpoint in Groseal. So it was always so kind of a paradox to me, I also got robbed in Detroit, but it was just interesting, In the School of Education, not so much. In the, because I was in educational administration, so they're teaching systems and how to function within the system. In the greater world at large, absolutely. And I think that's part of what I loved about being there. Not having ever seen U of M, somehow I had an idea what Berkeley was, and I was very attracted to any activism. And so I think part of what I loved about Ann Arbor, I don't remember specific affiliations with any organizations, but it felt like a place where that part of my spirit could be very at home. I think it was generated to a fire in Detroit by organizations and things I saw. I had some friends that were affiliated with very activist organizations, but it all grew out of Ann Arbor, right? Student for Democratic Society, and so yeah. Good memory. So within the context of this story, I've told you I'm a working class child. I grew up doing service work, cleaning people's houses. I was working 40 hours a week while I'm going to Wayne State, paying my own way. All I'm doing is working. There's no poetry, there's no romance, and maybe that's really what U of M gave me, is a little bit of that sort of ivory tower romance of the great ideas, and a haven and a sanctuary, right? And I wish I could tell you this wonderful intellectual memory, and I don't know, I loved working at the old German and hanging out there, and I I loved riding my bike through town, and I loved just bumping into Shaky Jake on the road and talking to Shaky Jake, and I loved the gay guys that came in and and sat at my counter and were there every day, and they became my friends and gave me a stuffed toy before I took my world tour. It wasn't just the university, but more this sort of this kind of marching to a different drummer kind of personality that I have. Um, it felt like she got to grow up in Ann Arbor. But the favorite memory, and it's such a girl thing, and it's so simple. So it's a snowy night, and I come out of a very snowy, pretty Ann Arbor night that has stopped the traffic, and I come out and of the School of Ed with a fellow student, and in the middle of the snowstorm, in the middle of the campus, he gave me a kiss, and it was so romantic, and it seems so simple, but I guess what I'm telling you is that I learned how to dream there. Because when I was working and going to Wayne, that never happened. Mostly I'd be like, hurrying down the street. This is one of my favorite Detroit stories, is I was walking to and from Wayne State to my grandma's to save the quarter. Honest to God, it was to save the quarter of the bus fare. And so you'd have to get your city on, right? And I was kind of cool back in the day. I had my little boots on and my little caftan. I spent 3 months in California, so I had a little California thing going on too. And I'm walking down the street because you're not supposed to look at anybody. You're supposed to get quickly from Wayne State. And somebody's calling my name, and it was my uncle. He's like almost yelling at me. He was a police officer, and I had put up my barrier so big, So finally I realized it was him. So anyways, there's all that. I can't leave Detroit. I'm writing about it. I perform in it. My daughter lives in it. My son participated in a documentary. Um, my daughter's a poet artist doing things in Detroit. I have a brother who kind of stays in Ann Arbor, stays in Detroit, but mostly stays in his car. He gardens in Detroit and sells at the Eastern Market. The Riverwalk has my family name. The Cullen family carousel is named after my family. But in part, because I love Detroit, I wanted my children to grow up near this community. It was somewhat of an active decision. I didn't feel like I wanted to raise them in Detroit, thus a ring suburb, because the schools were not so good, and I am an educator, But I find that Detroit nourishes my spirit to want more for the world. I guess I needed to be right in the middle of it. I couldn't stand outside and talk about it. I guess I loved Ann Arbor and the idealism, but I wanted the actual feet first thing. I now work with educators that are part of Teach for America, and I know U of M has an affiliation with Teach for America. And I work for Wayne State, and I'm in schools in Detroit looking at what's going on. So that's my long-winded answer. I couldn't leave. I just couldn't. And I go up to Ann Arbor all the time, and I was looking at houses this week, and I'm like, oh, you could live there. You could live there. And I'm like, you could, but you probably can't because of my personality. I just feel very committed to I'm really concerned about schools, and I'm really, really concerned about poverty, and I'm really concerned that as we do this renaissance of Detroit, that we're not asking big questions about the indigenous cultures or the stories that went before. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know.
Are you optimistic about this revitalization?
Am I optimistic? I'm a mother now whose daughter got robbed last week, so am I optimistic? They broke into her home with a crowbar. So am I optimistic? I'm optimistic that it will be financially stable and sustainable. I'm also optimistic in that even though sometimes it feels like it's pushing out from the core, I was thinking a lot about dreams, and maybe it's not any different than me being a kid that went to Ann Arbor and saw the campus, and I see this really pretty place, and I'm like, I didn't think I belonged there, but ultimately because I even saw it, I began to dream differently. And so I'm really, um, though I'm concerned about gentrification, if it sort of keeps people awake to dream in another dream, then I like it. I am optimistic that it's maybe good to see. You know, even for people that have nothing, it's good for them to see it in a way. As opposed to 20 years ago, there wasn't anything to see. So, I'm very aware of a lot of what U of M's doing in the city, and I've been very, very supported as an artist with the center in Detroit. Been invited to a couple of conversations down there. The conversation on the media last couple months ago was fabulous. I think there's great support of the artist. I like their semester in Detroit idea. I like that they're marrying things to the city as far as a student getting involved in volunteerism. I think U of M's doing an awful lot. I think it's almost as important to archive the narrative and the stories of the people who are in the quick and thick of the city now, who are living the existence of terrible, terrible schools and poverty. I think their conversation needs to be archived and upheld as well. That's what concerns me most about these times, is there are voices that we're walking right by, and I wish that U of M could find a way to create a forum for those voices. My daughter, who just got robbed, she did a musical event at her home. It was called Porous Borders. And maybe this is what I'm talking about when I talk about Ann Arbor and Detroit. We should have more porous borders. And this was done in Hamtramck, where Hamtramck circles around, Detroit circles around Hamtramck. And the event was called Porous Borders. And lots of artists participated. But she did something to me that was pretty outstanding, because she opened her garage space, which here she's in Hamtramck, and then Detroit's right across the street on Carpenter, and she created a performance space with microphones and drums and built benches, and like, rather than it be people just looking at what the artists were doing, she intersected with the larger community. People were coming around and sitting on the benches and bringing their kids, and they were spontaneous hip-hop performance, but her intention was to intersect with the Detroit people, that really, it's a very terrible neighborhood. Lots of abandoned houses, and it's known to be, or it's reputed to be, a drug neighborhood, and she just brought everybody in, and they danced and hung out. I always have advice for students. I'm all the time advising students to do things. The world is just so big, and we are so privileged. We are so privileged. I wrote this play about Detroit. I found this magnificent actress. She was African American. I wrote this part for an African American woman. She played this part. I've never seen a better actress. And we were interviewed and brought in by U of M Dearborn for the semester in Detroit course that's taught there. What was so interesting is, though, we're exactly the same age. We went to the same places and danced. We even somehow managed to date the same man, grew up in the same neighborhood. We're both actresses, we're both educators, we're both creatives. And the narrative arc of her life was so uniquely different than mine, and I couldn't help but wonder, and she and I have had this conversation, is it because there were more opportunities afforded to me because I was Caucasian? Certainly not because I was wealthy, but because I was Caucasian. You know, so I would just say, keep your eyes open. You know, stretch your souls. Ask a different question. I thought about this when my daughter got robbed, and it's very clear that it's a young teenager in the neighborhood, and I have a young teenage nephew. And boy, he's making his mom pray and worry a lot. But he's got something big to hold on to. He's got family ready to like send him to college, and if he needs, take him to rehab, and just dream his life big and go snowboarding. So he's got all these things that he could hold on to. And then I thought about the young man that robbed my daughter, and I'm like, what's he got to hold on to? I mean, I don't want him robbing my daughter, but he's a teenager off the leash, and he wanted to get some weed. So why is that story got to end differently for him than my nephew? Or why does he get more chances? So I'm sorry, I'm a preacher. You're really lucky you get to go to U of M. You're really blessed you get to go to U of M. And I went to a graduation party last week from some people that lived in Ann Arbor whose kids went to Pioneer High, and there's it's a feeder school for U of M, and they get to go to U of M. And just by grade point and living in Ann Arbor. But you see, they never didn't dream that dream, so we have to help people dream. I guess that's it. My book ends like that, dream big. But we have to help other people dream. There you go.